Let me introduce Samo first. Samo is a Foresight Senior Fellow in Political Science. He has been with the Institute now for a little over a year, I think, and it's been really, really a pleasure to have been collaborating with you so closely, Samo. I think, whenever you show up, I think you usually combine this. Well, I mean, I'm not exactly sure actually who said that, but, I think it's a common a common heuristic that if you want to think really, really long into the future, you better also get your history straight. So we usually really enjoy the historic bits that you pepper into the conversation, and from which you usually manage to draw really, really amazing future trajectories. So I'm going to post a few of the meetings that you've done for Foresight in the chat below. We often talked about institutions, their hidden values, and today we're going to do something similar, but this time we're going to talk specifically about very long-lived institutions. And for that, I will now read out to you a shortened version of a piece that I came across yesterday that was shared with me, and I actually thought it was really, really fitting and quite fantastic to introduce this salon. Okay, here we go. Bear with me. It's worth it, I think. So it is basically Nick Coldry and Bruce Schneier, and I'm going to share the link here. And they're talking about what is it that is so upsetting about COVID right now. And they're saying the answer can be found in an extreme thought experiment about death. In 2013, philosopher Samuel Scheffler explored a core assumption about death. We all assume that there will be a future world that survives our particular life, a world populated by people roughly like us, including somehow related to us or known to us. Though we rarely acknowledge it, this presumed future world is the horizon towards which everything we do in the present is oriented. But what Scheffler asked is, if we lose that assumed future world because, say, we're told that human life will end on a fixed date, not far that after our own death, then the things that we value would start losing their value. Our sense of why things matter today is built on the presumption that they will continue to matter in the future, even when we ourselves are no longer around to value them. Our present relations to people and things are, in this deep way, future-oriented. Symphonies are written, buildings built, children conceived in the present, but always with the future in mind. What happens to our ethical bearings when we start to lose our grip on that future? It's there, moving back to the particular features of the global pandemic, that we see more clearly what drives the restlessness and dislocation so many people have been feeling. The source of our current aphasia is not that the literal loss of a future, even the most pessimistic scenarios surrounding COVID-19 have our species surviving, but the dislocation is more subtle. It's a disruption in pretty much every future frame of reference on which just going into the present relies. Moving around is what we do as creatures, and for that we need horizons. COVID has erased many of the spatial and temporal horizons we rely on, even if we don't notice them very often. We don't know how the economy will look like. We don't know how social life will go on, how our home routines will be changed, how work will be organized, how universities or the arts or local commerce will survive. What unsettles us is not only fear of change, it's that if we can no longer trust in the future, many things become irrelevant, retrospectively pointless. And by that we mean from the perspective of a future whose basic shape we can no longer take for granted. This fundamentally disrupts how we weigh the value of what we're doing right now. It becomes especially hard under the conditions to hold on to the value in activities that, by their nature, are future-directed, such as education or institution building. So I thought that was a really nice segue into today's topic, especially because we're going to talk about long-lived institutions. So I'm super, super thrilled, and I won't say any more because Samo can do it much better than I, to welcome Samo to have a talk on why it is that we need long-lasting institutions, which of them have done quite well over civilization, and how can we make our current institution a little bit more like that. Samo, welcome. I'll make you co-host again. You can unmute yourself anytime. It's a pleasure to have you, and please let's collect questions in the chat, and then we'll launch into the discussion after his presentation. All right, Samo, welcome.
Okay, I'll jump right into it, and be mindful of everyone's time. There'll obviously be a good Q&A section. So one of the most interesting things to me, studying rise and fall of societies, of civilizations, these long processes that take thousands of years, has been which institutions tend to outlive a civilization, right? There are a few very interesting outliers. These are these organizations and sometimes types of organizations that can last several hundred years or even several thousand years in the extreme case. We might very easily think of things such as states or things such as cities, or even things such as orally transmitted myths of various kinds. There's a very interesting study that connected the Aboriginal myths of how the land was created and how the land was transformed with the actual geological record, right? With correct accounts of the sequence of how a lake was filled up or a lake vanished, or how the coastline changed and all of that. There's also been, I think, research that we can support less firmly of European folk tales, some of them possibly reaching to the late Bronze Age. This is on the basis of like linguistic drift and so on. So there are all sorts of interesting things that are not organizations that survive for a very long time period. Myths, cities themselves. I would actually argue that states actually have changed so much in the last few thousand years. We can't really think of anything like organizational continuity. You know, even 100 years ago, there were at least 2 European empires that just straightforwardly claimed to be the Roman Empire. I think neither of them had a very credible claim. This was Imperial Russia and the Ottoman Empire, right? Like one of the titles of the Ottoman Sultan was Kaiser il Rum, which is, you know, Caesar of Rome. So because there is this desire to keep up appearances and continuity, it can be very difficult to figure out when the substance of an organization actually persists for a very long time period. And one of the best examples I found of this were actually monasteries. Now, monasteries are, you know, fairly common both in the Western and the sort of East Asian tradition. There are some interesting parallels to other kinds of organizations that have dominated religious life in various parts of the world. But, you know, for now, let's just say that this is, you know, the key features that I think a monastery in this narrow sense should have is some form of communal living and some form of isolation from the outside world, both possibly already giving hints for the reasons for its longevity. One of the longest lived monasteries I found was actually a collection of monasteries on Mount Athos in Greece. Mount Athos to this day actually retains a certain amount of political autonomy and even independence from the Greek government. They're allowed to decide who may visit their mountain, for what purpose, what kind of goods should be shipped in and out. This autonomy was so important to them that it was enshrined into the Greek constitution when Mount Athos became part of Greece, and the European Union even granted them an exception, right? It was part of the accession negotiations between Greece and the European Union. The political structure of the island is interesting, as is the governance structure. I mean, I called it an island. It's a peninsula, but it's so inaccessible, it might as well be an island. The protos, who's sort of like, you know, the head of the monastery, because this monastic collective, is elected by representatives of the monasteries and kind of has been for nearly 1,000 years. There's attestations of people visiting the monasteries of the islands, and also the monasteries having autonomy in 911 AD. So this is back in the Byzantine Empire. So this monastery, through all the wars and revolutions, you know, the individual monasteries might have changed. The collection of monasteries was the same, and at least one monastery has in fact just kept continuity since 911 AD, with dealing with the Byzantine government, and then with the Ottoman government, then with the Greek government, and, you know, arguably with the EU as we know it today. The fascinating thing about it is the seclusion, right? The mountain was essentially abandoned and uninhabited. There's some evidence that there were people living there in the 3rd century BC and the 2nd century AD, but by the 6th or 7th century, it was just considered abandoned. So there's possibly a small lesson of, if you can thrive in a remote location that no one really wants, well, possibly your claims to this land will be respected and you won't be bothered. There's no farming to be done, no mining. Might as well leave these strange monks to their business. Especially if, you know, they pay some sort of minimum tribute, or if it brings you some amount of prestige, which it really did, right? It really did for both the Ottoman sultans and even later, arguably, for the Greek state. The reason is whoever was considered the political suzerain of the monastery receives the very lovely title of, Lord Protector of Mount Athos. And this might seem unimportant to us if we're not Greek Orthodox, but if you are a pious Greek Orthodox, this is clearly a sign that this is a legitimate government, that it respects your religion. And the Ottoman Empire pursued this as a policy. And obviously, because of the Greek national project requiring it, it was symbolically important for the Greek state to have this as well. There's this interesting way in which the monastery is not very focused on classical pursuit of knowledge, but ended up being a very good repository of knowledge anyway, and a good protector of artifacts. A lot of the ancient artworks from the Byzantine era are just considered normal icons of veneration by the monks. The monks don't like them because they're ancient. They like them because they depict, Jesus or Mary or the saints or whatever. And they tend to not want to change them because that, again, wouldn't be befitting the spiritual life, could be considered excessive and so on. But in recent years, the documentation from, say, outside experts has revealed numerous treasures, things that are of historical or almost archaeological importance, things that somehow were maintained and survived for a very, very long time period. Also, several Greek texts were recovered from the libraries associated with these monasteries and from the collections of books that at various times found shelter in the monasteries themselves. The life and seclusion of the people there makes it so that while they were involved with politics, right, they had this autonomy to them, they weren't ever a power center, right? So they were perhaps acting more as a useful resource. So I think this is perhaps the first big lesson. I think we should possibly try to draw out some predictions as to which institutions will be long lasting. And I think the first big criteria for how long lasting something will be, I think, is that it is not actually a very powerful organization. Now, there's one really obvious counterexample to this, but all the other organizations I can think of were never strong political players, right? And I'll talk about the one obvious exception later on when we discuss some of the other organizations that lasted a very long time. Why is it bad to be powerful, right? I often write publicly about political dynamics and so on. And generally, all else equal, it's better to be a powerful state or a powerful army or a powerful individual than not. I mean, you'll tend to get into fights and you'll tend to make enemies. There's a reason Mount Athos is around and many of the lovely monasteries of England are not, right? In the 16th century in England, the monasteries were politically important enough and wealthy enough that they made attractive targets for King Henry VIII. So you can visit some lovely ruins today of what remains of the monasteries, right? When the break happened with the Catholic Church, created sort of the Anglican denomination in partnership with the English crown, they could have very easily kept the monasteries. The Anglicans were a very moderate sort of branch of Protestantism. However, many of the abbots and so on didn't really want to get on with the program. So their land was confiscated and the monastic continuity was broken. There's perhaps a similar dynamic with Irish monasticism, though there the history is less clear, right? The Viking raids themselves reduced the importance of Irish monasticism, which for a while was just sort of the backbone of what could be seen as Celtic Christianity, and what some have even said is an important step in the preservation of Western civilization through the Dark Ages. An argument has been made that these were the main centers of writing, learning in the medieval European world, that in a way these were safer in isolated Ireland and the British Isles than they could ever be in the besieged Mediterranean world. I think that's an exaggeration because obviously, again, there's this whole Byzantine thing in the East, right? So there's a clear Greek source of knowledge, and obviously the Arab world is preserving a lot. However, that did sort of seed, I think, a lot of Celtic culture and deeply influenced both Britain and Ireland. So I think it's a nice example of this kind of this potential for a single institution to, from one era to the next, one civilization to the next, shape the next civilization significantly, right? There are other interesting examples of this. The Catholic Church itself is the one exception to this rule. It's a very long-lived organization that was extremely powerful for most of its history. I basically wouldn't predict such an organization surviving, but it did, right? And now we can discuss how long the organizational history of the Catholic Church is. Catholics would say 2,000 years, Orthodox Christians would say 1,000 years. To me, the answer of about 1,700 years seems about right, which is the point when Christianity becomes the state religion of the Roman Empire. That's why, the Pope in Rome is sort of the most important one. It's because that's where the emperors were, or that was where the center of Western Mediterranean authority was in the Roman Empire. And the continuity is obvious, right? Even today, I think that today the Vatican is the only state that still maintains Latin as an official language, right? And everything from the rituals to even the clothing of the priests just very much reflects that particular heritage. So the Catholic Church itself did have serious issues, which would be an understatement, in the Reformation. If I would have to guess, it is the sheer uniqueness of their claim that possibly helped them, the uniqueness mostly resting in this association with something that was like a clear center of imperial authority, right? Like the finding of this protector in first the Frankish kingdom and then the Kingdom of France, and much, much later, an alliance with the Habsburgs. All of this, however, seems so unsatisfying. It seems so accidental. It doesn't seem like the kind of clear-cut case we would want, but possibly just as with examining the lives of very old organisms, you can come up with all sorts of interesting stories for why this particular organism lived for so long when others didn't. But at the end of the day, it's just such a probabilistic mess that a clean inference is hard to make. So that's the one outlier. All the other works, the monasteries that have lasted for longer than 1,000 years, right? Or I'm going to talk about the examples of universities and libraries. These were not politically powerful entities. They were perhaps somewhat useful, but did not themselves exercise power. They might bestow legitimacy, right? Or they might confer economic benefit, but they were never a rival to a king or a senate or anything like this. The other interesting thing about the origin, say, of these types of institutions that can persist for a very long time is that some sort of economic activity seems to need to rest at their core. Monasteries themselves, again, today are mostly economically inactive. Historically, though, they nearly always had some activity. They were either focused on something like, everything from distilling alcohol to treating the sick to just general agriculture. At other times, copying of manuscripts, education, right, running educational centers and so on. For the universities, they pretty much evolved out of medieval guilds. They arose almost as guilds of scholars in the cities of Europe. There were not many medieval cities in Europe, but one of the biggest ones was Paris. The University of Paris is, it's older than both the rise and fall of Aztec civilization. Like, I really want to emphasize, it's not trivial that we have something that has been basically around almost continuously, with the exception of the French Revolution, for 1,000 years. And the other very old university, which is often invoked, Oxford, is just as old and had no interruption during the French Revolution. They both arise as these basically guilds of scholars, somewhat economically supported by, in the case of Paris, the cathedral, where they teach theology. So the key things are very interesting. It's theology, medicine, and law. a very simple argument can be made that these are all kind of, somewhat self-interested and rent-seeking sectors of the economy, right? Doctors tend to endorse other doctors, no matter how good medicine happens to be in your society. Lawyers always argue for the relevance of lawyers successfully. And theologians, well, that's perhaps commentary on organized religion. Let's say, I think the theology racket is the one that got most cut down to size, and where we're still waiting for the law and medicine racket to follow. But the economic value of lawyers to the French crown or the English crown is very obvious, right? You want things to persist there. You want things like even basic records that you might find in a university library. If they're teaching law, often they would keep things like land registries or copies of land registries. In medieval Europe, again, one of the first things often a so-called peasants' rebellion might do is storm local churches and local offices or other places where records might be kept and burn the records. Now, why would you burn the records? These are land deeds. These are literally the instruments of your bondage if you're a serf, right? These say that who you have to ask for permission to leave your land and who you have to pay stuff to. And if you burn these, it's not really easy to prove that you owe anyone anything for living on the same land that your ancestors possibly had lived on for 5 or 6 or 7 generations. So they were politically aware enough to try to do that. But what I'm pointing to is the opposite fact, where you might want to get rid of the monasteries to take their land. You probably won't want to get rid of the guild of lawyers, right? And if you can't get rid of the guild of lawyers, you're probably not going to get rid of a law school. Hence, you could expect the law school to persist through many different types of societies and perhaps, outlast many different legal systems. I'm sure France has gone through many changes, not least of which was the Code Napoleon and so on. And yes, English common law has also gone through many changes. Medicine, let's say that it has advanced, but, the success of medical schools, I think, is an interesting topic in its own right. But I suspect that the demand for medicine is always high. Like, even when your society's medicine is not very advanced, when you are ill, you often just want hope. And then you might, ask for the leeches or whatever, right? You might not really run all the epistemic checks you should be running. And this desire for medicine, there's always this potential for a significant wealth transfer from the dying to the healing, right? Now, universities today, do they still fit this criteria? A possibly interesting thing to consider is that, modern Harvard University is actually a quite powerful institution. Now, is it like the Catholic Church in that possibly it's, too big to fail, too powerful to ever remove from play? Or is it perhaps more similar to the abbots that, say, might have conflict with a Henry VIII 100 or 200 or 300 years from now? The baseline is also very different. The modern university system is arguably not just a system of, say, elite education. It's certainly more than the free arts and law, medicine, and theology. It seems to have become the central credentialing system of our society, where if you have a college degree, you are basically eligible for all kinds of administrative service. There's various discussions of how to implement, say, a civil service exam system that would be distinct from a degree. But for now, in practice, like, degrees are needed to work in various parts of, say, the US government, if we're talking about US society, since I was talking about Harvard in particular. The central credentialing mechanism of society is way, way weaker than the place of training of a guild. The central credentialing system requires this army of bureaucrats. A guild, that's just a professional association in a city. One way to think about it is that the University of Oxford and the University of Paris, which today is known as the Sorbonne because it got split up about 40 years ago. I think 50 years ago, actually, it's 1970s. They are piggybacking on the long life of Paris and the long life of Oxford. So cities, again, are not proper organizations, but you can have an organization tied to an economic niche in a particular city, relying on the persistence of that city. There is no bureaucratic or administrative state that I know of that has lasted more than 300 years without significant upheaval. This, by the way, is also true of, say, dynastic Egypt or dynastic China, right? China had several dynasties in sequence. And one of the first things you do when you establish a new dynasty is you just clear out the civil service exam system and you set up a completely different one with completely different staff. Sometimes, unfortunately, even killing the scholars that participated in the previous one. There was this quite brutal measure, say, I think in the 2nd century BC, but I might be slightly misremembering this, called, the burning of books and the burying of scholars. You can guess what this was about, right? This was about the elimination of most schools other than the legalist school in ancient China. And then the legalists who were spared this purge, who were promoted, they basically, ran the administrative state of the Qin dynasty. And this kind of thing happens a lot, right? Or they're barred from public service. A much less bloody example of this would be in many Eastern European countries, there was a limit put on who you could employ in the state, where if you were a member of the Communist Party before 1991, or if you're a member of the state security services, you were then ineligible for particular kinds of public offices or particular kinds of functions in the state security service. Like one really notable example is, if you were part of the Stasi, right, in East Germany, you could not work as a policeman in the newly reunified Germany, or as an intelligence agent, or as a member of the armed forces. In a way, a quite sensible precaution, no? Regardless, whatever's the case, these are really fragile structures. These bureaucratic structures, very powerful, very fragile. So if Harvard has transformed itself from a guild, such as arguably Harvard Law School remains, to the central credentialing system of the United States, in a way, maybe it's shortened its lifespan. So if I had to bet in the year 3000, barring the singularity or the complete, end of human life, if there is an Oxford University, I think it probably will be. Is there a Harvard? I think it probably won't be. I think it probably won't be there. So, maybe that's very interesting. You should keep yourself very local to a particular location, and you should occupy a niche, ideally in an urban center. So if you can't do that, inaccessibility, I would argue, is the second best bet. Like, again, Mount Athos is not very valuable land. For the third topic, this one is somewhat interesting in its own right. It is the libraries of Al-Qarayin, which is today it's a university in Morocco. It originally was a madrasa, which is a significantly different institution. It's somewhat different because basically, again, it's a law school, but it's a law school of Islamic law, which is paired with theology studies. So instead of these being separate areas of study, it's just kind of all really focused into this one thing. And the sort of free arts are not studied as such at these institutions. There's a pretty clear case where the library there is kind of maintained by what's essentially a law school. The interesting thing about it is that it's the world's oldest library. And it is also the institution where the famous medieval historian and sociologist Ibn Khaldun worked from. North Africa is kind of anomalous in this regard. It has several libraries of this type, some even in Timbuktu, literally, others in, other countries such as, again, Morocco, Algeria. I think there, the climate actually proves to be very helpful. It is dry enough and the conditions in these libraries are good enough that the scrolls were just preserved, right? So you have sometimes 500, 600, 700-year-old scrolls in a library that's seeing active use, right? And it's like a quite remarkable thing to have paper last that long. The value, again, is mostly, I think, in the legal documents. And as a side effect, the historical books, including works by Ibn Khaldun and so on, get preserved. And the main distinction I would make from this and, say, a university is that a lot of these were not in urban locations. A lot of them were in more remote locations. Some locations actually started off as urban locations, but the local towns kind of died off. However, how are you going to, move all of this stuff around? Just proved very difficult. There was a good system of travel in North Africa. So people would travel to receive a legal education that could be valid anywhere in the Islamic world. So, okay, I think this might be a good time to open for questions. I talked through a lot of examples. If I were to summarize all of the points, again, briefly, it would be try not to be too powerful. If possible, piggyback off of a city or be so secluded that your land is completely worthless. And last, try to attach yourself to a guild, but not to a bureaucracy. So these would kind of be these three, say, principles for very, very long-lived organizations. Cool. Should I check the chat for any questions already, or Allison's possibly any you've already picked up?
Thank you. Well, all of those happen to coincide. Hello?
Hello, am I still coming through? Am I audible? Okay, good.
Yeah,
good.
Can you hear me? Yeah, can you
yes,
hear me?
I can hear you now.
Can you hear me, Samo? Okay. Okay, I was just saying it happens to be that those qualifications, or the characteristics that you mentioned also coincide with what makes institutions really high quality. So I think
that's not an accident
that you mentioned that makes them long lasting are a little bit saddening, but here we really high quality. Okay, here we go with the Q&A. Janati, you're first. I'll unmute you now.
Yes, thank you. And I find it a fascinating insight that institutions which are long-lasting are not particularly powerful. And this is fascinating, especially because I myself am highly interested in longevity, not particularly interested in power. So with regard to creating a long-lasting institution these days, what are some strategies to protect it from possible attack, not just by the more powerful institutions, but also by insurrectionaries against the current powerful institutions who might be saying things like, if you're not with us, you're against us. If you're apolitical, then you're political in support of the status quo, and you have to pick a side. Especially in more volatile, more polarizing times, how does an institution aiming at longevity essentially build moats around itself or place itself on a sufficiently remote mountain, analogous to the monasteries you described, that neither the powers that be nor the insurrectionaries will get to it or have a particular desire to get to it?
Well, on a very long historical timescale, I think that both, local insurrections and totalitarian governments represent a significant risk for any organization that wants to maintain its coherence. I mentioned sort of, medieval peasants' revolt. One can certainly sympathize with the peasants and still sort of not want your legal records to be burned or whatever the equivalent is, right? You might just be literally in the way, no matter how neutral one tries to be politically. I fear there's only a few things to say. There's not necessarily very good solutions. In particular, I would note that there's a reason there are not many extremely long-lived, long continuity monasteries in mainland China today. It's not because they weren't, religious traditions with very, very long track records, thousands of years, or like beautiful and remote locations. It's that there was a program during the Cultural Revolution and the period that immediately preceded it to specifically target and remove those institutions, right? The desire was to, this is perhaps so interesting because today I think people tend to associate, the Chinese Communist Party with things like the Confucius Institute. In the 1960s and 70s, the Chinese Communist Party really hated Confucius. Like the normal story was that, oh, look, traditional Chinese culture is backward and feudal, and it's the reason we fell behind the West. And it's, it supports gross inequality. It's terrible. We should throw it all out the window and produce a completely new socialist culture, right? So that was kind of there, right? That was the desire. And that led to the destruction of many of those monasteries. The situation in Tibet is a little bit different because, in Tibet, there was a desire to transform it to be a part of China. But there's also this kind of situation where the Dalai Lama has been living in exile, and the Chinese state had some interest in keeping sort of a version of Tibetan Buddhism in an organized way alive, so that when the current Dalai Lama passes away, the next Dalai Lama is chosen in a process, in a territory that's sort of controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. This has led the current Dalai Lama to toy around with ideas such as, maybe I won't reincarnate at all, right? Like that's, talk about an exit strategy, right? Like, I'm just going to stop reincarnating if all my successors are going to be in controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. I'd say that the remoteness is very good against insurrectionists because they usually don't have the resources to go after you in those locations. For, say, totalitarian governments, I think, unfortunately, depending on how strong their ideology is, ironically, the more idealistic and the less power hungry a totalitarian government is. I guess in a way they're all power hungry, but the more idealistic it is, the more earnestly it believes in its own ideals, the more it might want to go reach you just for the sake of reaching you. Because often one of the premises of totalitarian government is that, all other modes sort of of being are unacceptable, right? So, or at least set a bad example. So yeah, I think physical remoteness is probably the better defense. The other one is, I note that there are recorded crossbow fights between the citizens of the city of Oxford, so town, and the representatives of the University of Oxford, gown. So, okay, maybe have some crossbows around if you happen to be in a city. That this was during periods of instability in English history. Those like aspects of civil war were actually engaged, right? I found it really funny, imagining them shooting each other with crossbows. They probably found it less amusing. Cool, perhaps next question.
Hi, Samo. Allison's suggested I can go next. Fascinating talk. Like you, I do believe futurists need to understand history. And it's an open question as to how much the history is relevant and how much of it will be transcended by the new powers that are in our hands. So I want to ask a specific question about what advice would you give to the cryonics organizations who are seeking to have some continuity for decades, perhaps centuries, to continue to exist in potentially very uncertain times? Because it does seem to me that there will be groups in the future who have more power than ever before. They'll be able to track down people all over the world more efficiently than even the greatest autocrats and empires of the past. So it looks like just making yourself remote won't be sufficient. So what are the practical advice for Alcor and Cryonics Institutes and others who want to reassure their members that they have a reasonable chance of the organizations not being destroyed in the next decades?
Yeah, I think that's difficult. I know only a few things about the current situation of the organizations. So what I'm going to speak to is what I think a cryonics organization with some resources could try to go for. Unfortunately, one of the avenues that seems most promising, that in fact is the thing that allowed the libraries I discussed to persist for so long were these irrevocable grants of land. There's an Islamic legal mechanism where if something is for the public benefit, such as a fountain, or for religious benefits, such as, say, a mosque, you can permanently sign this over in a way that cannot be sold, cannot be expropriated in accordance with Islamic law. And there are some mechanisms through which you can rent it out and things can be paid out and all of that stuff. There's no such real mechanism that would have quite the same level of protection as it did in those North African contexts that I'm aware of that would apply to, say, like, current American interpretation of, English common law. I, by the way, think that English common law as such is very likely to outlast US law specifically, right? I think it's the US is an amazing country, one of the best countries in the world, like, clearly has a lot of things going for it. But, states tend to have this about 200 to 300 year cycle that I described, especially once they reach the like heavily bureaucratized stage. But legal systems can sometimes outlast them, right? Like on the continent, Roman law has some descendants, and, British common law looks very resilient overall. I don't know if such mechanisms could exist. I think I would have probably heard of them by now. I know people like Robin Hanson and others have looked into various unusual ways to bequeath resources to distant descendants, right? There are currently, I think, legal limits put on how long you can, say, keep a fund going. So I think that mechanism doesn't work. I think that given that this mechanism doesn't work, because I think that would be the most natural one, long-term ownership of land would actually be very, very good if it could be secured, or long-term, ownership, say, of something like a very large fund, though the very large fund would be more tempting for expropriation, arguably, than the land. And also, who knows what happens to currency, right? Unclear. There might be various shocks that wipe that out. Given that that's not an option, I think the guild approach might be best. If you could somehow, say, gain a monopoly on all US funeral services by law, or somehow make it required that medicine be studied only at the Cryonics Institute, and you have to take a class in cryonics or something to be a doctor, that would be extremely powerful. I think that's something I could see lasting for 500 or 1,000 years, really. Because once these things are lodged in as a privilege of a particular group of practitioners, it's just really hard to get rid of them, right? The guild system that I mentioned as kind of one of the origins of the university, like in France, the guild system persisted all the way to Napoleon, right? Not even the French Revolution managed to fully abolish guilds as economic units in France, right? So there's something to be said about this kind of white collar self-interest, and it's a very material self-interest. There might be some space for something like monastic activity, something like spiritual or religious or psychological practice, but that's a difficult social engineering challenge. And if you transmute it into a religion, I wonder how long the cryonics practices would actually just be best cryonics practices rather than, well, this is the way we've done it for 400 years, right? Whether or not the technology has changed, right? Or you start having people think of things like, well, we're preserving these to be, revived at Judgment Day or something. We're not actively trying to bring them back, which I think would defeat the purpose of cryonics. Yeah, I'd be very interested in a follow-up question or a response you might have to these musings I've just shared.
Very quickly before I let other people ask, when I wish I'd share your optimism about the respect for the rule of the law and so on. Mm-hmm. But it does seem to me that various political leaders around the world are bending the law more than before. They're violating past conventions, and they don't seem to mind that they're violating past conventions. And it's easier for them to violate conventions in a way that not even Napoleon could do, perhaps. So I think it's a tough question, and I don't know the answer. So I'm happy to hear what others on this crowd mind have to say. Thanks.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the good question. So what would be a good next question?
Well, thanks. I once moderated a panel at a crypto. Oh. Hello, can you hear me? All right, I'll take Geoff next.
Hey, Samo.
Geoff, go for it.
I'm Geoff Anders. I run Leverage Research. We study the history of science, trying to understand how scientific progress was made in the past and whether there are things that we could learn from that that would inform our attempts to understand the world today. Samo, I loved your talk, thought it was great, and I was interested in, you mentioned the Catholic Church as an exception and hard to understand. I wondered whether you thought there might be similarities between Harvard and the Catholic Church. If the Catholic Church is an exception, would Harvard end up being an exception in some way?
Well, I think that, I think I did not hear the very last sentence of your question, and it seemed very important.
Yeah, it was
in the audio.
Oh, sorry about that. I'm wondering whether, if the Catholic Church is an exception, whether Harvard might also be an exception in some way. And so I was just getting your thoughts on that.
Well, I think Harvard would certainly like to think of itself as that exceptional. I think people probably from Yale or Stanford would disagree, let alone people from MIT. But yeah, it very well might become an exception. If it did, I think it would have to do something other than credentialing as its core activity. I think that it could become an ideological center of some kind or a religious center of some kind. You know, one could argue, you know, Harvard started as a divinity school. Maybe it's still a kind of divinity school. It would be very interesting to see what happens. You know, I'm just talking here realistically, you know, while wishing the US all the best. Empires rise and empires fall. So the origin of the Catholic Church, as I said, was the aftermath of the fall of the Roman Empire, where the Roman state religion outlives the Roman Empire. I wonder whether US schools could continue to be seen as prestigious long after, say, US power is gone. You might have an unusual situation where people visit from China to get a classical Confucian education at Harvard, or people visit from India, or people visit from the Middle East, or whatever part of the world is like the powerful and wealthy part of the world. You know, this might sound a little bit funny, but there's precedent for this. It's kind of unusual, if we think about it, the extent to which Chinese tourists visit Europe. It, after all, is in a way a center of culture. A lot of global, you know, cultural legacy is there. There's a lot of cultural legacy in India, in China, in Japan. Why Europe? I think the kind of like remnant of the prestige of the old empires make it so that people want to see Paris, they want to see Rome. And possibly, you know, people would want to study at Harvard. So if Harvard could outlive the United States and possibly outlive China too, and have associations both with Chinese students and American students, maybe it could persist. And maybe again, if it left an ideological network that outlived the economic and military power of the United States, maybe that, if it became much more organized, like the Catholic Church, could outlast it too. I suspect, though, that religion is fundamentally more psychologically powerful than more secular ideologies. I think Harvard would have to commit to an interpretation of metaphysics to reach like an ideology to be like truly, you know, as good a fit for the human mind as Catholicism manifestly ended up being, right? It ended up being one of the big religions of the world. There are 1 billion Catholics, you know, there are 1 billion Muslims. No other religion really is in an organized way as successful as these two were, right? So yeah, I hope that kind of answers your question. I'm very, very skeptical of it. If I had to bet, I would bet that there is still a much, much smaller Catholic Church in about 1,000 years, and that there is not Harvard. Again, modulo no singularity and no collapse. Yeah. Cool, next question.
Hi, Thank you. My name's Jim Clark. My main way I've been known the last 20 years is founding and running the World Technology Network, which has been doing the World Technology Awards for those years in 20 different categories, with all the winners and finalists in all those categories becoming the fellows of the network. So there's about 1,500 fellows in 40 countries who are peer elected as the most innovative in all their fields. I most recently founded a new nonprofit organization called the World Congress for a New Civilization, which is a very ambitious project to try to birth the seeds of a new global representative institution. Obviously, there's resonance with the fascinating topic that you talk about. Before I ask the question that I had originally written, I just had one quick comment based on some of the ones said already. It occurs to me that if the brand of longevity for a particular institution is the gravitas tied to longevity, as has been the case with the places that you brought up, then that might make the brand too culturally valuable to fail. With which it's too valuable to not affiliate in some way or another. So it becomes a kind of meta value that has to do with longevity itself. Therefore, to diminish it, to end it, gets rid of too much value in a cultural sense. So it's protected by its own longevity, which keeps growing by definition.
There's an argument for that, but that is not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily snowball to the point where it overrides a need to abolish it. Let's remember, I just mentioned Catholicism and Islam. Islam is currently missing a caliph, right? And there was a caliph, which was the head of the Islamic religion, all the way until the end of the Ottoman Empire, where in the course of the Turkish Revolution, it was so valuable to remove that, the caliphate was just abolished.
It wouldn't mean it's the most compelling point, but it's.
But you make a very, very good point.
A factor that.
Yes.
So my question, in the shorter term, has to do as follows. Although the topic of long-scale longevity of human institutions is fascinating, that's why we're all here. The length of a single human lifespan, or even the general sense of generational legacy, let's say perhaps a few generations, as well as the complexity and unpredictability of all the other societal context, might make it largely irrelevant knowledge from a practical perspective that we're discussing here, all these great insights. Are in your research, or even just on a personal perspective, are there anything sort of midterm, these 1 to 3 lifespan lessons that you found you can share that might actually be different than this long longevity that you've been talking about?
Right. 1 to 3 lifespans. Okay. Yeah, I mostly deal with institutions. So in a way, personal advice is less useful.
Well, I'm asking about institutions.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, obviously founders and so on, that's an interesting edge case. But yes, for 1 to 3 generations, what I would recommend is, if possible, again, owning valuable urban real estate in cities that have endured for a very, very long time. That is helpful for both very long-lived organizations and less long-lived organizations, right? It's one of the things that can help keep you alive. The second one tends to be have a very, very clear mechanism for recruitment and evaluation of employees or members or converts, whatever type of organization you happen to be, that does not necessarily rely on the quality of ambient credentials. A PhD in 2020 is not the same as a PhD in 1920, is not the same as a PhD in 1800, right? These become very different objects over time that signal different things. And, again, 1 to 3 generations, that can be 50 years or 150 years. So over a 150 years scale, or even a 100-year scale, or even a 50-year scale, If you can insource your evaluation of talent, that is the best situation to be in. I think that preserves you from some of the issues larger scale institutions are going to run into. I think on the mid run, it actually does pay to be powerful, and it does pay to be wealthy. Basically, if you bank on whatever the current central coalition of power in society is persisting, if you're large enough, you're too large to fail. Eventually that central coalition fails, right? But until it does, you're pretty safe, even if relatively, less powerful. Even if relatively not that competent, I would say. It's possible to have a very dysfunctional institution that's part of essentially what you could consider a ruling coalition that ends up being, saved by the allies because it's too valuable, right? This might even be true of, say, dynastic fortunes. History is filled with these dynasties where the son or the grandson or the daughter or the granddaughter is just not a very competent sovereign, but loyal ministers to the family kind of save the day. And then, hopefully the next kid turns out a little bit better, right? So there's this way in which, no one is really interested in switching the royal dynasty in a dynastic context again. So that keeps them around for about 200 to 300 years again, which is, way longer than the window you're asking for. Optimizing for a mission that persists in a rationale for existing. So a source of legitimacy that persists through changing circumstances. If you can, create an organization which had a mission that would be just as valid in 1950 or 1990 as it is today. Why? Because in 30 or 50 or 70 years, the technology is going to be arguably as different as our current technology is from 1990 or 1950 or whatever. And the social and political circumstances are going to be at least as different as well. So, have something that's a little bit timeless. It doesn't have to be, it can, you should assume the Industrial Revolution and you should assume computers, right? But, it's maybe a good thought experiment to have something with backwards and forward compatibility in its mission. You can't totally predict where things are going to go, but if it's like coherent in this small time window, it's probably going to continue being coherent for a little bit. If you have a strong thesis about the future, that things after 2005 are all going into a direction and they'll stay going into that direction, that's fine too. But then consider how much confidence you have in this thesis that things have changed so much and that the future direction is so clear that you can bet things on it. Say, for example, I can imagine someone creating some kind of institute for the study of blockchain law or something like this on the basis of a strong thesis that, blockchain is only going to continue transforming the economy and legal arrangements and, smart contracts are the future or whatever. I wouldn't make that bet, but I can imagine someone making that bet. Or say someone might make the bet that, actually, climate change is going to be solved in about 10 or 15 years due to ambient technological progress. But conservation of wildlife and wetlands and all of that, that's just still going to matter. And people are still going to want untouched, pristine natural habitat. So, that's why I am raising a fund for long-term conservationism, which is raising money in first world countries to buy up land that is still cheap in underdeveloped countries and creating national parks there and lobbying for national parks now before all the vested economic interests make it, silly to do that. Like that's a made up objective, right? Possibly for all I know, someone's doing that, but that could be something of a strong environmentalist thesis, for example. So those are kind of the criteria. Those are the things that come to mind. Hope that's a good answer.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know we're now 9 minutes over, but do you still have a few minutes for us? We could go until past. Yeah? Okay, cool. Because I know that there's at least 7 or 8 more questions in the chat. I'm going to take Chelsea Voss next. Chelsea, say maybe a few words about yourself, and then I'm going to say the list of whoever's in the queue in the chat. So you're ready. Chelsea, it's very nice to have you, and you're unmuted.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Hi, I'm Chelsea. I work at OpenAI. I was wondering if you have any insights about how easy it is to found new guilds. I'm not sure if this is something we would have evidence for from history, but any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that, now first off, I have to distinguish where creating a new guild as in creating a new profession versus merely creating a guild in a profession that's already, had guilds in the past. Yeah, I think that, and when I say guild, right, I'm using this term in such a way to capture things such as like, a National Association of Lawyers, right, in 2020. This kind of like self-interest. I think it is notably easier than, say, reshaping civilization or creating these organizations that are really bedrock institutions. So it's easier than being a prophet. It's easier than being a reforming general. It's easier than being like, a founding lawgiver. It's probably a little bit harder than creating a company. So I think it is harder than creating a company to create something that is a self-interested vehicle of organization for a profession. Creating a whole new professional ethic is, I would say, even harder. So say, for example, I don't think programmers should do this, but it's very interesting to consider the hypothetical credential of, computers are dangerous things. We really shouldn't let just anyone program. Now, of course, anyone that's already programmed computers, they obviously are grandfathered in, but really, I think you should probably go through like a 10-year course. And at the end of the 10-year course, there should probably be an exam. The exam should probably, have a committee of people, the people who already know how to code, who've coded prior to us introducing this rule. And this is, of course, for public safety. So you could create a guild of programmers. The key thing you would have to change here, and again, I sort of feel like the openness of programmers has been epistemically healthy for them, and the kind of positive sum mindset of both teaching others and mentoring others has been like, to their moral credit, possibly even economic credit. However, if you wanted to change that, you would need to run something like a set of arguments saying something like a public relations campaign aimed primarily at the programmers, but also at the public. Imagine that you ran a campaign saying that, basically unfettered technology has ruined our elections. Social media has ruined our brains. We really have to do something about this as programmers, or the technology backlash is only going to get worse. I want it to not get in the way of our work. However, we have to think about the future. And then running something like that, that's harder than like a local association. It's not as hard as doing a religion. So I would compare it as about as difficult as creating a new political movement. So yeah, about that level of difficulty. Hope
Thank
that
you.
answers your question.
Thanks. Next one up, we have Paul Hugel's question, and I'm going to read it out. I think his microphone isn't working. He's asking, if I understood correctly, since 1929, the Vatican has attained autonomy, although not long-lived. How do you see their potential to be a long-lived institution?
Well, the Vatican acquired autonomy from the Italian state with the Lateran treaties, with the Accords in 1929. But before that, there existed the papal state, right? So I'd argue there was a longer history. And while, the Vatican was officially not independent, according to the Italian state, after Rome, the city of Rome, was absorbed into the newly unified Italian state, the Pope insisted otherwise, and the Italian government never arrested him. So there's an interesting way in which, even though he didn't have legal recognition, he was too strong to like simply kind of arrest. Like, imagine if I had a giant palace in the middle of Manhattan, and I was insisting that US law does not apply to me. And I was even writing to the citizens of New York that in order to be good citizens of New York, their immortal souls are in danger if they vote for anyone in the current election. because this regime occupying my palace in the city of New York is completely illegitimate. Like from a perspective of a state, it's an insurrection, right?
It sounds a lot like Pablo Escobar to me.
Oh, well, maybe he was running an insurrection. It is like that, isn't it? Yeah, it's a good comparison. But my point was how extreme this sort of like non-compliance with the Italian state was. So I would argue that the papacy de facto had autonomy, but between the 1880s and 1929, the Italian state was saying, you don't have autonomy. And the Pope was saying, I have autonomy. And it turned out the Pope was right, ultimately, right? That's what I would say. I think that the papacy is in a more difficult position than it used to be physically, because they used to have a state they controlled. You know, in the modern world, you know, there's this really funny Joseph Stalin quote where there's a diplomatic communique his foreign minister brings him from the Vatican regarding something about the course of the war and how treaties should be drawn after the end of the war. This is World War II. And he replies, the Pope, how many divisions does he have? Right. The answer, of course, is the Pope has no tank divisions, right? This is something that's very different from the medieval era where, you know, the Swiss Guard was quite formidable. And this lack of like military and state power, that might end up being a problem. However, I suspect the papacy will adapt. The Dalai Lama is an interesting example. Were there to come some kind of political instability or some sort of great difficulty or war to modern Italy, which would bring the papacy into an unfortunate position, I basically think the Pope would choose this kind of exile and would be, as an exile, too interesting and too politically useful to arrest. So if only there's not something like a one world state or something like that, I suspect a Pope in exile, much as currently there is a Dalai Lama in exile, would come to be. So cool. Hopefully that answers that question.
Thank you. Okay, next one up we have Anish. Anish, I'll unmute you now.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So my question was about the characteristics that you gave for long-lived institutions. You said that they should either be completely marginal or they should be powerless. My question
completely marginal or very, very powerful, possibly. Yeah.
Right. Or attached to a guild that is structurally indispensable in some sense.
Sure, exactly.
No matter who the ruler is. Okay. So my question was about the powerlessness part, because it does seem that causally these institutions are nowhere near powerless. In fact, I would say that they might be more definitive of long-term historical trends than, you know, one-shot, small-time power players, which is what 99% of power plays usually are. So it's not as if they're causally powerless. So my question was, is it, but practically they're either illegibly powerful in that they set not the text of the dispute, but the context very often, as religion often would have, or they are sufficiently far removed causally that for medium to short-term power playing, there's no reason for a power player working over that time scale, which is what most humans play to even pay attention to the universities, because it's not as if, you know, that's going to make a difference. So would you say that it's, you know, it's like, is it permissible to be powerful if you are sufficiently far removed and illegible, so to speak, that there's no direct causal link for most power players' individual lifespans?
I would say that there is, if you're trying to operate on timescales that are irrelevant to most people, right? There are ways in which you can still get in trouble. You know, there is a way in which you could argue that poets and philosophers and historians have often aimed to affect the world in a way that transcends their lifespan, right? Like the desire is you're writing for eternity. You're not writing for your contemporaries. Yet they often still end up getting in trouble politically as individuals. I would agree that causally speaking, say the monastic community on Mount Athos, for example, it would weigh in on church disputes on theological questions, right? The head of the monastery, the monastic community that I mentioned, is in rank equivalent to a bishop, right? So they're still subordinate to the Patriarch of Constantinople, but they would have a real say in, say, theological decisions of the Orthodox world. And they went through like really important decisions, right? Things that define it today, that define the societies that have practiced Orthodox religion. Or on the other end, the practice of law as seen at the University of Paris, or the practice of law as seen in Oxford, had these massive effects on the development of economies of the countries, and even eventually the politics through things like inheritance law. So yeah, causally, they can be very, very influential. But when I say power, I mean this power in this very competitive landscape, right? Now, I think the competitive landscape is sometimes tied to individual ambition. However, reason of state is a nice counterexample, right? Like raison d'etat. So there is a tendency in something like a central government to want to level things that hold particular kinds of resources, right? Or co-opt them and assimilate them. So there are power plays and tendencies that exceed individual lifespans. If you try to model Russia, the development of Russian territory as the ambitions of individuals, I think you kind of get some things right, but not most things. If you model Russia as solving basically timeless geopolitical problems, then the pattern of expansion becomes way more logical, right? So again, the fact that geopolitics seems to be somewhat predictive of things on the scale of 2 or 3 or 400 years, outlasting a human lifespan, suggests that there are power objectives that go beyond a single human lifespan. Cool, hopefully that answers the question. Should we go for the next question? I think.
Steve, you're already unmuted. Go for it.
All righty. So all we've been talking about is sort of things in the political realm and sort of individual power seeking, how that plays into it. But I was wondering more, haven't been discussing the cultural side of things, which is to say sort of the everyday behaviors and values of ordinary people. And particularly in the context of the future, it seems that this is going to be a bigger and bigger thing. And as a result, maybe you can't do something that has timeless values anymore because the value drift is just going to be too much for society in general, for enduring institutions, period. That's it.
I mean, you know, if that might very well be the case. I want to emphasize that values did change massively in the past as well. It was often the case that values wouldn't change for a few hundred years, and then in 5 or 10 years, values would change immensely, right? So I think sometimes we don't notice past change, right? Like we say, for example, sociologically, right? People might often mistake, you know, the sexual norms of 1900 to be quote unquote traditional sexual norms. And then they end up doing things like misunderstanding medieval England, let alone ancient Greece, right? Which obviously had a very different.
Sure, that's the whole question is how much are these institutions in name only? There's this sort of, and that is an indeterminate question you can never really answer. So,
well, there are various things you can take as evidence, right? So if there's a rule book on how you pick the Pope, and the rule book in most of the historical cases that we have records of how Pope was picked is the same, I think you can make an argument that, okay, that mechanism persisted, right?
Sure, yeah, artifacts are a great source of the limited stuff you can do.
Right. I mean, obviously, like there's never ending fight with entropy when it comes to history, but in fact, there are many things, you know, it's the nature of the universe. Entropy rises in a way we know less about the world 100 years ago than people that were alive 100 years ago. And this is despite, you know, the printing press, say, removing the destruction of a loss of most books that might have been around back then. But I think it's possible to know certain things about the past, and it's possible to establish, say, things like, you know, continuous habitation, consistent application of a rule set through a very long time period, consistent practice of a ritual over a very long time period. And again, these are outward facing behaviors, the explicit justifications attached to them, or even let alone the phenomenology and lived experience of people going through them, might change radically. But this clearly is some culture that we can say persists, like practice, right? That is an aspect of culture and an important one. And sometimes they do persist. Now, if future value drift is like very catastrophically, or, the opposite of a catastrophe, like delightfully.
Who's to say if they're drifting?
Sure.
Who's to say if it's catastrophic?
Maybe it's utopian.
What's the correct point to evaluate it from? Yeah.
Right. Maybe it's eudaimonic, but if one is a value relativist, then when one answers that question with me, right? You say, well, of course, right? From my values, these are the correct values.
But this undermines, gets back to the whole acedia concept or whatever at the beginning, which is that if you can't extend your values beyond your own life, then society tends to break down. Sort of the best.
Well, it tends to break down things predicated on those societies. Let me state this.
Okay, go on.
Sorry, maybe I'm misunderstanding you. The thing I was going to say is that I proposed projects that would be just as valid or timeless. Like they tend to persist because the surrounding society finds value in the institution you created, right?
Right.
So if future societies don't value whatever institution you create, of course that institution is like very vulnerable to it. The case of, again, the totalitarian society I discussed is when it might actively value disassembling whatever you have set up, right? Like that's like a really adversarial case. So I think there's no real good solution for really radical value transformation, for timeless, like planning for, things that you might build that might persist into the future. I think it's like, yeah, the future is more powerful than we are, because presumably the future is there, and presumably, unfortunately, most of us aren't there.
All right, not if we get the cryonics thing sorted first. Okay, next one up, we have Nancy.
I think you're muted still.
Walt, we can't hear you.
Wait, I'm unmuting Nancy now. You're unmuted.
Oh, good. Hello?
That's better.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, I was wondering, let's see, this is not about institutions, but rather really a fundamental change in the way we can expect to live, which is very tight surveillance all the time by the state powers, and potentially even
maybe the mass surveillance will be privatized, yay, or something.
But
it's
also,
like either one's not great.
What about when people live to be 200, 500 years old? It's not improbable.
Sorry, I was just interjecting, but could you just restate the question for me? I'm sorry, I missed it.
What will be the effect of pervasive and deep surveillance and great increases in longevity?
Okay, so if we're predicating two technologies, it can be really difficult to predict even the consequence of one technology. So I'll say a few things about each one of those and then try to synthesize them to see what I can say. For radical longevity, I think one of the first effects will be much higher expectations of social skills, because basically it seems to be that one of the things that does happen over the course of life is that social skills continue to go up. How much you care about things, like that's different, right? You might become more disagreeable. But when they were doing studies, even on people who presumably are already suffering cognitive decline from aging, they noticed that they scored better on conflict resolution. And this is despite a culture gap. So when they were like essentially asked to resolve circumstances of young people in modern circumstances, the older people somehow did better than the younger people. Like that's to me very interesting. That suggests that there's some form of crystallized intelligence that continues to accrue. Perhaps this is what they used to call wisdom a few centuries ago. So there are certain kinds of skills that humans seem to just be able to learn that have no real clear upper bound. Whatever skill demand exists there, the standards are going to become higher and higher over time. The second consequence is, I think, inevitably, there will be more inequality. I think life is good, so I think life is worth some more inequality. And the inequality will be quite intangible. You can tax away the billionaires, but can you tax away 300 years of personal connections and favors? Not really. So even if you have a nominally hyper-egalitarian system, right? Like say nominally the Soviet Union was hyper-egalitarian. In practice, connections, favors, and all of that still produce economic inequality, let alone power inequality. The third one is, I think education is vastly better. I think in a society with more longevity, there is much more incentive to have master-apprentice relationships, right? Where you have a deep personal relation with someone who's truly like excellent at the craft and they take a strong interest in you. I think that becomes quite viable. And the differentials between the true masters of crafts or domains of knowledge versus the, you know, flash in the pan, that becomes clearer over a 300-year career compared to a 30 or 40-year career or a 10-year excursion. So I think education is better. I think, you know, the vast libraries of the human mind that currently, you know, burn down every generation don't burn down. So I think all else equal, more knowledge of the past is preserved, more knowledge of the present, and just more understanding of the universe is achieved. So I think it's just cognitively very good for society. There might be significant amounts of generational strife. There might be a class system of some kind. Unclear to what extent that happens. But I would not be shocked if there's an age-based class system, essentially, right? Where the early adopters are there. Now, let's flip this to the other side. Mass surveillance, ubiquitous surveillance. I think the strongest psychological effect will be a pressure to, I think the biggest effect of knowing you are watched is not the person doing the surveillance or even the algorithm doing the surveillance. It is your own knowledge that you are watched. Now, if this was 2015 or 2010, I would probably cite social psychology studies. For the sake of epistemic hygiene, I won't do that in the aftermath of, like, you know, the replication crisis and all of that. However, I still find myself believing, and, you know, take this with whatever grain of salt you find appropriate, that the psychological effect of someone being watched is significant. They sometimes can't access, they have different emotional responses to the exact same situation. They have different thoughts. They might not be able to quite figure out how they themselves are feeling or thinking. If someone's looking at you, you might have a harder time, say, figuring out that you're angry or afraid than if you're sitting alone, introspecting in this way. Further, if routinely we bring up extremely detailed records of people's online behavior, and note everything's online, right? Everything's online in such a world. Or people's, like, you know, movements and thoughts and actions are always recorded, can always be mined for a viral clip or something like that. I think that would be an immense psychological pressure to conform. I think people would be terrified of being too different. And they would deeply, deeply want to be basically the same as everyone else, on the assumption of, what, are you going to arrest everyone that used that word in 2040? In 2040, we had no idea that word was bad, right? Or, you know, whatever other social issue might arise, right? Like, you know, look, we were all eating meat in 2050. But note that this defense only works like, you know, we were all eating meat in 2050 before, say, meat eating became completely taboo or something like this, right? Like, that's where I think the conformity drive is going to strengthen. So I'm really pessimistic about that. The second big effect is, I think we will tend to believe that decisions made on the basis of data mining are rational. So I think there'll be a new form of legitimacy. People will say, look, it's not personal. It's not my greed. It's not my desire to be powerful or rich. The algorithm says you have to do it this way. Now, of course, I'm like modifying and tweaking the algorithm, but, you know, really it's the algorithm saying what you should do, right? You know, big data in the cloud might just start being this, like, you know, like strong source of social authority. So these are two super pessimistic takes. If I were to give an optimistic take on mass surveillance, I would say that there are numerous tragic aspects of human behavior and, like interpersonal abuse that in theory could be eliminated with the use of mass surveillance. You might wake up in a world where there is no bullying as we know it, no sexual abuse as we know it, no physical crime as we know it, right? Possibly. So, but I'm really struggling to come up with like a utopian upside to that one. So combining these two, my brain kind of breaks. I feel like I don't have a strong, straightforward prediction for what happens when you overlap these two radically different technologies. Yeah, I think it's too hard for me to predict here on the spot.
All right, thank you so much. I think in that world with surveillance, at least no one would engage in violence apart from the surveillors. So
well, obviously state-sanctioned violence is not violence by definition. Like, haven't you been reading your dictionaries?
Okay, I'm sorry. All right, I'll do my homework, Samo. Okay, well, now we're really 6 minutes over the overtime, so I'm going to cut it out here. I'm going to thank you very much. I'm going to thank all of you for your fantastic questions. I think we could be doing this for hours and hours on end. I think this just means you must come back, dear Samo. I am already looking forward to the next time. I would definitely ping you again. I think, people have really enjoyed this one. I'm going to share the recording with all of you afterwards. Samo, thank you so much for joining us. I can't wait to have you back on. I'm going to open up breakout rooms for those who want to continue chatting. And Samo, if you have any final words, then now's the time.
Okay, I don't necessarily have a message, but I wanted to thank everyone for the very good questions they asked. I really enjoyed the discussion. I would say that perhaps the key thing with regard to these very long-lived institutions, right, is the realization that the future is shaped by many forces, right? Some forces will be very new, but some will be very old. The thing is, an autonomous monastic community from, the Eastern Roman Empire is not something you might expect to find in 2020. But in fact, just such a fragment persisted and is an active part of the world in 2020. So whatever you imagine the future to be, however you would project the future, you should assume some surprising fragments of 2020 will be present in it.
Okay, can we say surprising fragments of 2019, please?
Sure. I hear those are still around. I think we still have some parts of 2019 around.
Yeah, I hear they survived somewhere. Yep. Okay, I'm creating breakout rooms now, and many of you will see each other there. And thank you so much. This is the end of the official salon. Samo, I can't wait to have you back on again, and I'll see most of you hopefully next week where we do this again. Bye, everyone. Thank you.